All right, friends and neighbors, welcome back. We are doing Chapter 6, Configuring Basic Switch Management. So, how do you connect to the switch and how do you control access? So in this video, of course, we'll do the Do You Know This Already set of questions, and then we'll figure out how to secure the switch CLI. So what we're going to try to remember here is that we can log into the switch, and then we've got all of these levels of passwords that we can put on there. And then we want to figure out, well, how are we going to connect to the switch? So there's a whole bunch of ways to get there. All of them will be using the CLI. It's just how we get there and how we lock it down. We've got this concept of a line, and that is how you actually connect. And then we can say, well, can we tie this to usernames and passwords? And then we'll go across the network with Telnet and SSH, and we'll add our IP configuration to the switch. And then lastly, we'll talk about some useful settings. All right, do you know this already? So question 1, if you have configured an enable secret and then an enable password, which one of these will you have to enter to access privileged exec? Well, this has everything to do with the fact that you've added 2 commands on there that sort of do the same thing, but one of them is secret, and so it's the order of operations that's important here. So it's B, enable secret. That's the more secure way of doing it. What would be a useful way to set up password protection with no usernames? Now, when you are setting up the switch, what we had to remember here is that you can set up a password so that the minute somebody goes to connect, there's a password there, but it's not actually tied to usernames, and that's just with a login on the VTY or a login on the line. In switching from Telnet to SSH, with a previous password of my password, which command would be part of the new configuration choose to? Well, because SSH doesn't allow you to log in without a password and is tied to a username, what you need to do is set that up. That's at the global level. And then you need to tell the switch that you're going to be logging in with local. That is, you're saying to the switch, use the usernames and passwords that are stored locally. Question number 4, for a PC connected to a switch and then to a router that connects to branch offices, what command would allow the engineer to log into the switches with just a password? Couple of parts here. That's why there's so many things to select. First of all, that switch is connected to a router, and then it's connected to branch offices. So there's a lot of networking that goes on here. So we would have to go into a VLAN, give it an IP address, configure a global default gateway, and then we would have a password on the VTY, which is what we would use for SSH or Telnet. Question number 5, if all ports are in VLAN 2 with an address space of 172.16.2.0, which 2 commands would be required? This is a networking question again. So the first thing that we would need, obviously, is an IP address on the switch. We put that on the VLAN. And then if we want to be able to get to it from everywhere, right, the question was a little bit longer than this, we need a global default gateway. Lastly, which line command tells the switch to wait until a show command's output has been completed before displaying log messages on the screen? If you've worked with consoles before, or the CLI, you know that occasionally logging messages pop up, right? When something happens, the switch spits it up there and then interrupts what you're doing. And so it's really annoying. So logging synchronous will turn this off. Now to get started, let's recall a couple of things. First, we have to remember our modes, right? We have user and then privilege, or maybe enable a mode. So the user mode, you can do a couple things, not as much. And then you go to enable or the privilege mode and you can do more. You can also get to configuration there. So right, that's our 2 sort of levels. And what we want to be able to do is figure out which one we're using and can we do passwords everywhere. Now, line is the thing that describes how you're connecting. So we have console as a line. We have the terminals that we're going to be using, Telnet, SSH. These are all VTYs. And so we are going to work on the configurations of those 2 things as well. The fun thing is you can put a password just about anywhere. And so anyone, by default, if they have a console cable, can walk right up to your switch, plug in, get a console in, and start learning about your switch and about your network. Well, you don't want to do that, so we could put passwords on that. And then if we want to, we can say, well, we're also going to add an enable password. Now, the minute we're going to connect remotely, that requires an IP address, and we're not going to be connecting to the serial port, the console port anymore. We're going to be connecting usually via Telnet or SSH. Could be HTTP or HTTPS, but right away, we're going to need passwords for Telnet and SSH. So we're going to move off of the console configuration and put those passwords in there, give an IP address, and then we can tie those to users as well. Now, to get started, we can say, well, I want to put a password on this device. So the minute somebody touches it, there's a password that they have to get by. And so that's an important level. We could do that. Now, the nice thing is that it's not tied to a username. And because it's not tied to a username, everybody would sort of use the same one. So that means it's sort of what we call shared. Now, we could also put a password on the next layer, right, which is enable, and also not tied to a username. Now we'll find out that it might be nice to tie them to usernames so that we're not sprinkling the same password all over the place. We'll do both. So now there's two lines that we want to talk about. One is the console and one is the VTYs. The console is going to be controlled with the line con, in this case 0. If we're doing anything else, we're going to be using the VTYs. In both cases, we would put a password, and then we would say login, and that instantiates that password, so they have to be used. Now, if we're doing a VTY, we might also specify the type of transport. In this case, how are you going to be connecting to the device? Now, above me here, I've got this diagram that sort of shows two different connections to the switch. In one case, the blue console line, that's going to be the line con. And you can configure that, right? There's no IP-based networking there at all. The other one is an Ethernet connection, and over that one, you're not getting to the console port, so you would have to configure VTY. And after that, right, then you can do the enable password if you want. Now, instead of shared passwords, you could say, well, let's do per user passwords and get rid of that whole VTY and console thing. So the example in the book is the username Wendell and secret or password Odom. Secret is the more secure version. We'll talk about that, I think, in chapter 10. But if you decide to use usernames and passwords, you need to tell the switch where those are stored. Now, the key phrase here is login local instead of just login. So it'll be login local, which means use the accounts that are configured locally on the switch. You could also use an AAA server, which would be a server out on the network that would be authenticating all of the users. And of course, if you're doing Telnet or SSH, we have to remember there's an IP address. We'll save that for later. If you're doing usernames, when you log out, a logging message is generated, and that's tied to the username. Okay, so I think it's time to do a demo. What do you say? So here is a PC and a switch, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, let's take a console cable connected to the console port and then run it over here to my EIA 232 or RS 232 port. This is a serial connection that has nothing to do with networking. Now on this device, I could say, well, I'm going to cheat and use the CLI here, but that's not really what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here as if I had just walked up to these switches, right? They're in the rack, and I've just walked up to it, and I'm going to connect to it. Now the application that I'm going to use here is a terminal. So this would be like PuTTY or something. And if you remember from your console connection parameters, it's 96.8N1 and then no flow control. So we're going to say OK here. And you can see that this looks a lot like the CLI that I would have gotten over here. Right there it is right there. But we're not using that. So here's our terminal. Now our first step was to see if we can configure a password just to connect to the thing. So I'm going to say enable, right? So far, there's no passwords or anything, no security whatsoever. Anyone could walk up to your switch and connect. So I'm going to go config T, and then I'm going to say line console 0. And this is specific to the console connection. And we can see that I've got all of these options here. So I'm going to say password, and I'll just say hello. Oops, hello. So that's my password. Now I'm going to say, listen, I want you to apply this for folks that log in. There we go. So now if I go all the way out, right, and I want to connect again, all of a sudden there is this password. And I have to type in the password that I just used, and all of a sudden now I'm in. Okay, but I can still get into my enable level. So what I could do is this now. I could say enable password, and I got a couple of options here. I'm just going to specify, I'm just going to say what the password is. I'm not going to do this other stuff. We will talk more about the levels of password and things like that, but I'm just going to say, I don't know, hi there. Okay, so we'll go all the way out again, and I will say, oh, I've just connected to this thing. What's the password? Well, it is hello. Now I've got an enable password, and it was hi there. And there we are. So that's 2 levels of password that I would have to go through just to start configuring or looking at things on the switch. Well, now what if I said, I want to control this thing with usernames and passwords. I want to tie it to that. So that'll be our next level. So I'm going to say username, and we'll use Wendell. And then I've got a password, oops, spelling counts, password of Odom. There we go. Now, I've created the username and password, but I'm not actually using it. So I need to go into line console, and I'll tab expand that for you, line console 0. And I'm going to say login local. And what this says is, I want you to consult the locally stored usernames and passwords to log in. Now again, I'm not going across the network at this point. This is all stuff for the console connection. So now if I go all the way out again, all of a sudden I have a username prompt. And so now my username is going to be Wendell, and my login will be Odom. There we have it. Now, if I want to go to enable, that password is still there. There we go. Okay, so that was just a login for the console, just a password, and then a login for enable. And then we said, well, let's tie this to a locally stored username and password. All of this is over the console connection. Now, earlier I said the phrase AAA. This stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, anytime you have a network-connected server that's handling your usernames and passwords, keeping track of when and where somebody logged in, how long they were connected, all of that stuff, that's an AAA server. Now, it turns out that AAA is just a framework for how these things ought to operate. And there's a whole standard that describes how this operates. Now, in the networking world, most of the standards that we care about are RFCs from the IETF. So requests for comments from the Internet Engineering Task Force, and they're all available online. So you can go out and look at RFC 2904 and get a feel for what the AAA framework is. But it's just a common scheme that says, look, if you're going to set up a server that does these things, here's some guidelines for how the architecture ought to look like. Now, at first glance, you might say, well, why would I do that? I can set up user accounts on the switch and that'd be fine. Well, what if you had 100 switches and you're going to do those user accounts everywhere? and then somebody leaves the company, or you get somebody new and you got to manage all of those accounts. That would be a pain. So much easier to store them on a server. Yeah, you have to set up the server, but once you set it up, you just point all your devices at that authentication server and you're in good shape in the long run. Some examples of AAA servers that we see all the time are Radius and TACAX, TACAX Plus. Now, I have said Telnet several times, and I'm going to show you how to do a Telnet connection, but we don't like to use Telnet. Telnet is really, really insecure, and I'll show you exactly why here in just a minute. So what we want to use instead is Secure Shell. Now, when you get access to the command line interface on an operating system, you're actually in a shell. Yes, when you're connecting to a Cisco box, we call that the command line interface. But if you were doing that from a device or from a command window someplace else, you're actually part of the shell. In Linux, we use the bash shell all the time, or bash all the time, which is short for the born again shell. There was the Bourne shell, there's the corn shell, the C shell. There are all kinds of shells that just describe what that interface looks like and things that are available to you as a user. Okay, so that's the shell part. But secure shell is really just encrypted telnet. We don't want to send these things across the network clear text. Now, it turns out you can read about secure shell in a set of standards, and yes, there are RFCs. So, RFC 4251 starts the whole process, and it is the architecture. So you can read about how all of this happens, right? How do we set up keys? How do we do key exchange? How does the algorithm actually work? What is modulo arithmetic all about? What are these high prime numbers that we're talking about? So the Diffie-Hellman key exchange is part of this whole discussion. So Telnet, but with encryption. So you get the same console that we saw in the console connection in Telnet or SSH, but in Telnet it's unsecured, and in Secure Shell it is secured. But if we were going to set up Secure Shell, we need to do a couple of things, right? We need to go into that VTY, and we need to say, well, look, I want to be a fully qualified domain name. That is something that can be resolved to this particular host, because that's part of the keying material. Then we need to generate the keys, and then we need to specify, how big the modulo is going to be. Like Telnet, we're going to need an IP address. Now, if you're getting confused at this point, don't worry. I'm going to go through Telnet, and then I'm going to go through SSH. We'll do demos of them both. But first, let me show you why Telnet is insecure. Okay, here is a capture of a Telnet session that I did in the lab. And you can see I'm at packet 101, right? And so what does packet 101 say? Packet 101 says, give me your password. Now this is the prompt that appears in the Telnet window, right? Type in your password here. See if you can guess what the password is. Now before I show you, or maybe before we try to get you to guess, you have to know that every single keystroke in Telnet or SSH is actually a packet that goes across the network. So there's one character in each one of these packets, starting with this one. Capital C, I, S, C, O, and then the line return. So there it is, the password going across the network in clear text. And if you didn't catch it, the password was Cisco. That's why we don't like Telnet. Previous packets actually would have shown the username that I had set up. Now, before we can set up Telnet or SSH, we have to realize that we've got to turn on networking for the device, right? At this point, I just have a PC connected to the console. There's no real IP networking, no Ethernet networking going on at all. Now, when you're dealing with a switch, the first thing that you do is you go into a VLAN and you give the VLAN an IP address itself. Remember that by default, all ports on a Cisco switch are in VLAN 1, so that's what we're going to be working with. Now, we'll talk a lot more about VLANs and how they operate later on, but right now I'll just say that each VLAN can have its own IP address, and you want to make sure that you're using a VLAN or addressing a VLAN that has somebody connected to it physically. Otherwise, the VLAN will not be able to be brought up. Now, IP addresses that you give to a VLAN can be static or dynamic via DHCP. Now, if you're doing bigger, badder networking, like the question example at the beginning of the chapter, you might want to add a default gateway or a name server in the global configuration, but we're not going to bother with that today. If you wanted to use the web UI, you can actually browse to a Cisco device or use web clients to get there. Then you turn the switch or the router or whatever you're working with into a server with the commands down there at the bottom. So IP HTTP server, IP HTTP secure server, and then you describe how you want the authentication to go, right? Are you doing local or are you doing an AAA across the network? Now, before our last demo, we'll do some handy commands here. First of all, we know the up arrow can give me a history of the commands. You can describe how big you want that history to be. You can see the history. You can do that for everybody or for a particular user. If you want to control what's being spit out of the console to you when you're working with the device, sometimes it's really annoying. They block what you're doing temporarily. You could say no logging to the console. That turns it off, and then you could turn it back on with logging console. You could also do the logging synchronous. This was also one of the questions that says, whatever you're doing, don't tell me anything until a show command happens. Now, if you're sitting there thinking about what you want to do, sometimes the terminal will time out. The default is 5 minutes. You could change that. And the one that we'll demo today, because it's really annoying to me, is if you mistype something, right? The Cisco device goes out and tries to figure out what you're trying to do. And it does that with an IP domain lookup. If we turn that off, it doesn't do that anymore. So we'll try to remember to do that in the demo. Okay, let's do some Telnet and SSH. So at this point, we just have our console connection, no networking. So I'm going to take this PC and move it over here to this other side. And just so it's not confusing, I'm going to add another PC. And this time we are going to connect right to the port. So we're going to go Ethernet this time to an Ethernet port. There we go. And we need to do a couple things. We need to set up networking on the switch so that we can talk to it. We need to set up networking on the host as well. Now, if you just got the device, right, it doesn't have any networking configured. So I can't use this node to do it. I have to use my console node. So what I'm going to do is go in through my terminal again. And I'm going to say, well, I got to do my username and password. And my enable password. So now I'm going to configure this. And I'm going to go, well, let me remind you about our VLANs. If I do our VLANs, we can see that all the ports are in VLAN 1. So that's what we're going to be working with. So I'm going to say int or interface VLAN 1. Now I need to give it an IP address. So I'm going to say IP address, right? How do I want to give it an IP address? Well, it's very common when you have network devices to give them statically configured IP addresses. We do the same thing with servers. You could do it via DHCP. I'm going to do a static here. So we'll say 192.168.1.254. And we'll say 255.255.255.0. So that's my address space. And I will also say no shut to bring this VLAN up. Okay. Well, what I'm going to do now is go over here to my other PC and let's give it an IP address. So we'll say 192.168.1.1. And that should be sufficient to see if I can at least ping it, right? So here's my command prompt, and I'm going to say ping 192.168.1.254. Now the ARPs will have to go back and forth, right? But now we should be able to, as soon as that happens, we should be able to talk to it. There we go. Well, now what I want to do is be able to telnet to this particular device. So I need to set that up on my console connected device because I'm not ready to go yet. And to do that, what I'm going to say is line VTY and then the range of VTYs that I'm going to use. Now these are connections, right? It's not line console, it's line VTYs. These are terminals, virtual terminals outside of the console. So what do I want to do here? Well, I could do the exact same thing that I did before. I could say password, and then since we're here, we'll do, I'm going to try to remember all these passwords. Password howdy. And then I'm going to say login. Okay. So now if I come over here to Telnet, if I say in my command window, I'm going to say Telnet 192. Oh, wait, there's something I forgot here. Forgot to show you this. Right? My options, right? This thing kept appearing in the slides right there. And in the book example, he does transport. Now this is what goes out and what comes in. So we need, we'll do the question mark. We need what comes in. So the protocol that's going to be used to connect to this, what are we going to use? Well, we could say, it doesn't matter, use them all. I'm going to specify Telnet right now. Okay. So maybe what we'll do is show you the whole thing so far. Whoops. We'll go down to that configuration. So here's my IP address that I put on the VLAN. And here's what I have configured currently. So that's PC0. This is my Telnet, or my console machine. We'll close this. And we'll go back with PC1. And now I'm going to try to Telnet. Now this is just the password, right? It's not tied to a username, so I've got this password prompt. And this would prevent anybody from getting into my switch. Now if I wanted to do the enable, I still have that enable password. Okay, there we go. Well, now that we're here, we might say, well, this is not a good idea. So I'm now going to say, well, let's go into my line VTYs again. And say, let's do login local because I want to tie these to usernames and passwords. Okay. Now this is going to overwrite what I was doing before, and we should bring up our friend Wendell again. So I'm going to say, let's get out of this. We're terminating our Telnet session. So now if I Telnet in, now I've got a username prompt again. So we'll go back in as Wendell. There we go. There's our enable prompt and hi there. So now we're back in. So now we're going from PC1 right here to our switch across the network, and we just use Telnet. But then we go, wait a minute, Telnet is not secure. So let's go back over here and we're going to say, let's fix that. Let's go to an SSH configuration. So there's a couple of things we need to do. We need an FQDN that's going to tie to this machine because we're going to use that for keying material. We need to create the keys, and then we need to specify the length of the modulo or the modulus that we're going to use. Okay. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to specify a host name here. We're going to say hostname switch 0. And this ties it to this particular switch. Now what I'm going to do is say IP domain name. Let's get the mouse out of the way. IP domain name. And it's going to say, well, what do you want your fully qualified domain name to be? Now this would be what somebody would look up with DNS. I'm going to say switch0.hartpence.com. There we go. So that's my domain name. So I've gotten my host name and domain name straightened out. Now what I need to do is generate a key. So now I got my crypto commands, right? Crypto, and what am I going to do? Well, I have to create a key. And well, what do I want to do with my key? Well, I'm going to generate the key. But what kind of key do you want to generate? It turns out there are several algorithms for generating keys. In this particular case, we're going to do RSA. It's our option that's available to us. These are the initials of the three guys that were at the forefront of all of this. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to say, oh, wait a minute. What is your modulus that you're going to use? And I'm going to use 1024. That's the book example. There we go. Okay. So now, theoretically, I have set up my keys and I'm ready to go. Except I've got to do that transport thing. So now we're going to go line VTY again. Oops. 0 to 15. Okay. Now it just said SSH is enabled. So that's nice. So now what I can do is I can say, well, I'm going to say no transport input telnet. Now this is a little spoiler for next week, right? And I'm going to say transport input. What do we have available to us? Oh, we could do SSH. There we go. Now, theoretically, we should be ready to go, but you know what we can do? We can check our config just to make sure. And so I'll do a show run here. We'll go all the way to the bottom. And we'll see that I've done the login local here, the accounts. I've got my transport that's SSH. I've got an IP address. I should be ready to go. So what I'm going to do is exit out of this. Now, I'm also going to use another app here in Packet Tracer that is an SSH client. So I'm going to say, well, I'm going to SSH. So if I was on the command line, I could do, Wendell at 192.168.1.254, but here there's a space for it. Wendell, and then I'm going to connect as Wendell. Oh, and it says, well, what's Wendell's password? Odom, and there I go. Now I'm in user exec, and now I go enable. Oh, what's the enable password? Hi there. And now I've just set up secure authentication with my switch because I'm encrypting everything. Well, there we go. So that's Telnet and IP networking and SSH. Oh, I almost forgot. What happens if you do some oops with your command? You go, oh, I typed in a command. I can't remember what it is. There we go. And the switch says, what in the world is that? Hold on. Let me see if I can figure this out for you. And it takes forever because it's trying to do a lookup. Now, there is an escape sequence that you can, if you know it, you can get out of it, right? And it says lookup aborted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say no IP domain lookup. Okay, and now if I make an oops, right, it doesn't actually do that at all, right? There's no long delay. So that's a really handy one to remember. It drives me crazy when you do this, and for some reason your escape sequence isn't working. Well, there you go. Our look ahead to Chapter 7, Configuring and Verifying Switch Interfaces. So a little deeper dive into what you can do with a switch once you've started working on it. How do you control how it operates, right? So speed and duplex. Does it do auto negotiation? The automatic crossings. Can you put descriptions on things so you know what this part of the configuration was for? Ranges and shutdowns, a little troubleshooting. So there we go. So that is next week. Really, really handy commands, right? Especially that range one. I use that one all the time. And no is a special friend of mine too. Boom, done. Chapter 6, Configuring Basic Switch Management. So we did how do you work with the console, right? How do you set up a password just on the connection itself? Then we said, well, what if I want to tie this to usernames and passwords? Can I do an enable password? Okay, cool. What happens if I want to do remote access, Telnet SSH, versus the local connection? So AA servers, they're out there on the network. Am I doing local accounts instead? Okay, so let's get an IP address set up on the VLAN. Let's configure the VTYs for either Telnet or SSH, but if we're going to do SSH, we need to configure all the encryption stuff, right? The host name, the fully qualified domain name, the generation of the keys, and then the modulus. So there we go. And then along the way, we did a couple of handy commands, like getting rid of that lookup. Well, like and subscribe if you took control of these devices and now understand a little bit about controlling logins. And no matter what kind of management you're doing, may those packets always reach their destinations. And remember, certification. You, me, we're going to do this.